Okay, so we'll sort of start this presentation. We're going to be talking a little bit about writing a case neg. There's a couple things that we'll sort of do. We'll talk about what is a case neg. We'll talk a little bit about why write them during the DDI and also during the year. We'll talk about how to, and then we'll talk a little bit about sort of organization of a case neg file. Okay. So last week, every lab worked pretty hard to research and vet aff ideas and form some sample 1ACs. So far every generic group has produced some off-case position that they believe spans a large number of affs on the topic. And earlier this week, each lab, either already has or is about to learn what affirmatives the other labs have been writing, and will be tasked to write a case neg to each affirmative. So that's sort of the goal for today, is to learn how to do this effectively, so you will be efficient and productive during this week. So what makes a case neg distinct from a generic? So what makes a case neg distinct from a generic, or how do you define what a case neg is? A case neg will have cards to specific affirmative cases that can be used for on-case and off-case arguments that you might include in your negative strategy. So a couple of important parts of that definition. They're specific to affirmative cases, right? So unlike a generic that is supposed to span multiple affs, it's supposed to span the specific affirmative that you're describing. It should have both on and off case arguments, right? So you should have, case front lines that respond to the advantage areas. You should also have off case arguments, right, for each of those specific affirmatives that you would include in that negative strategy. Before I jump into just how to cut a case neg, I want to talk about the rationale of cutting a case neg. My guess is that the thought probably has crossed all of your minds at some point, that given the really high diversity and volume of affirmatives on this water topic, wouldn't it just be easier for me to specialize in a generic negative position? So, if you're sort of more policy minded, surely, you could just read some combination of key protection as cessation of use and the state's counterplan to corner every affirmative. Or, if you're more K oriented, settlement is a structure, not an event. So all affirmatives in that structure are objectionable. Negative prep is complete after I highlight the DDI settler colonialism file. No, that's definitely not the approach you want to take. I don't mean to discount the importance of having a set of tournament ready generic files on the negative, but it's also vitally important to do case neg research. And there's sort of three main reasons why that's true. The first is that affirmatives are mediocre. Affirmatives are mediocre. No offense to everybody who worked really hard to write 1ACs for the lab, but most 1ACs tend to have glaring logical and evidentiary holes that the neg can exploit. If the affirmative has a monopoly on the specific evidence and can pass those logical and evidentiary holes by the negative team, more often than not, the affirmative team will win, right? That's more true at the smaller and squirrelier the affirmative gets, right? That, if you don't have any sort of case specific arguments, that they likely will have sort of maneuvered around, your sort of common arguments. The sort of thing to sort of note here about smaller and squirrelier affirmatives is that the internal link between some of the small, tiny fixes and the sweeping impact claims that are being made tend to be pretty tenuous, right? And writing a case neg is sort of the only way that you can write a number of counterplans and critique strategies that shouldn't be overlooked. Okay. The second reason why you should cut a case neg is that affirmatives are written in a way to corner generic arguments. Okay. Affirmatives are written in a way to corner generic arguments. 2As chose to read smaller affirmatives like the US-Mexico IBWC or the AT Lab's atmospheric water, because they think they have a handle on the generics produced by each group, right? So, my guess is that the reason why, people went towards the IBWC aff and the atmosphere aff is likely because they think that it is a good response to the state's counterplan, right? So as such, if a negative is unable to anticipate how 1AC is designed to answer generic arguments, or unable to spin their generics with specific arguments about an aff, or don't have specific on-case or off-case positions, they'll 100% of the time lose to a prepared affirmative team, right? The third reason to write a case neg. Case neg prep is vital to your competitive success in the regular season, regardless of the circuit you're debating. So the DDI tournament that happens at the end of these 4 weeks is meant to simulate a tournament that has 6 schools, with each lab basically modeling a school, right? If you didn't write case negs to the teams in your circuit, frankly, you just didn't show up to win, right? You just didn't show up to win. Your regional invitational, your CFL, your NSDA league, whatever you debate in, has a predictable number of teams that you will always hit. And once you receive intel about that team's aff, it would be prudent to put together a specific strategy. Even if your circuit's primarily national, there will be a set of teams that are in your same bracket, or that you seem to debate fairly regularly, that you should be writing case negs to. It was really strange because this year, when I was coaching North Broward DR, we seemed to always in round 5, like we did this like 4 or 5 times, debate this basis Shavano XM team. And they just kept debating us over and over again. I imagine in sort of the round 5, 6 high-low debates. Another sort of example, a couple of years ago when I was coaching North Broward MR, they debated a Cypress Bay team of Kotler and Kotler that we debated them 7 or 8 times during the year. So even if your sort of circuit is primarily national, there's going to be a set of teams that you consistently debate. The other sort of corollary to this is that it's really unlikely and unsustainable for any program, even a big program, to break a new affirmative at every single regular season tournament, right? Just think about like how you prep, and also even if they have a lot of coaches or whatever, they're like no team has sort of the research power to go and cut a new aff for every debate or even every tournament. My guess is that people are reading the same aff from tournament to tournament. So what that means is you should pick a couple of affirmatives to write case negs to, and that's a sort of vital part of the tournament preparation process that you'll undertake. So now that we've sort of covered the rationale for cutting a case negative, the next sort of thing I want to talk about is the process by which you should cut and write said case negative. So each of you at this point, or maybe tomorrow or the day after, will have a sample 1AC from a lab and a plan that you're working from. Okay. Here's sort of the step of things that you should do, and my suggestion would be to get out a piece of paper and write this down, or whatever note-taking device you have on your computer. You should definitely start writing this down because this is what you'll be asked to do. Okay. The first thing that you do when you're writing a case negative is not to jump to a strategy that you think might exist. The first thing that you do is to read the article for the affirmative solvency advocate in depth, and then compare it to what the plan does. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. The first thing you should do is to read the article for the affirmative solvency advocate in depth, and then compare it to what the plan does. As a recap or refresh, the solvency advocate is the card or series of card that says the plan is key to solve the advantages. Okay. What are you reading for? You should not just read their card. Don't just take their card for granted. Okay. You want to not just read their section that the crafty affirmative team in the crafty AT lab or KM lab or wherever has selectively highlighted and underlined. You want to read the whole article. Okay. You want to read the whole article. What am I reading for, and why did I start with this? Well, there's a couple of reasons, and there's going to be quite a bit under here. The first is clarification. Okay, clarification. Water governance in the U.S. is super complex, and the policies used to fix it are even more complex. Okay, I know from just personal experience that we had at least 4 hours of like cross-examination on the treaties affirmative, the IBWC affirmative, and the AT lab. And I think my personal comprehension of this affirmative was around 30% until I read some of the solvency advocate articles from Milanes and the specific minute that was being described, right? So reading the solvency advocate is the only way for you to really comprehend what the affirmative does so you can negate it. Another sort of additional bit of this is that you might find, for example, the Milanes article that I just mentioned for the, IBWCF, actually has the minute that it would propose. So that is sort of a pretty good clarification on like what it is that the plan would suggest. Okay. The second reason why, you start with the solvency advocate is you understand sort of the larger context in which it's being written. So solvency advocates generally don't tend to write about only the plan in a vacuum, right? They're not usually that convenient for debate. Usually the plan that's being spoken in there is spoken in a larger paragraph about recommendations the author suggests that often expand far beyond the plan alone. So it'll be like, we have 8 recommendations. 1 is the plan, and 2 through 8, it is a bunch of other things. Okay. So for example, let's pick a different aff. If I was reading a set of policy recommendations regarding FS's right of nature environmental personhood 1AC, I might find one paragraph about the importance of extending right of nature to Lake Erie, for example, but it's likely that there's a whole section of paragraphs there. There are multiple, suggestions for policy changes. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because of solvency deficits in all causes. Okay, solvency deficits in all causes. All causes are other things that might cause the advantage. Solvency deficits are reasons why the plan maybe is insufficient. If the conclusion of an article describes how to implement non-anthropocentric rights and then lists multiple recommendations like expanding a right to nature to non-water resources, so not just Lake Erie, but maybe the forests that surround it, or maybe we should be giving, for example, national parks also a right to nature. Maybe it describes a collaborative framework, not just between the federal government, but between the states and tribal governments to decide who represents nature. It might describe new doctrines for determining legal standing for litigation. And the plan only did the first thing, which is to extend a right of nature to the lakes. Right. The remaining 3 things that I just described there could be reasons why the affirmative did not do the necessary things to solve the problem. Right. Those are useful solvency takeouts, or at the very least prove why the plan could be necessary but is insufficient to solve the full scope of the impact. Another sort of tidbit of that, you should study the plan text for any discrepancies between it and the recommendations made in the Solvency Advocate. Okay, you should study the plan text for any discrepancies between it and the recommendations made in the Solvency Advocate. A lot of times the 1AC will phrase a plan text to be more topical, and thus will have to exclude some key parts of the recommendation that you can exploit for a solvency argument, right? One example of this is the IBWC aff. The Milanes article is describing a binational water bank and not a unilateral minute, right? So you can find sort of, that their solvency advocate doesn't quite match with what it's describing in the plan, right? Or other times the 1AC might include things not related to its water protection to solve better, but that can be exploited for an argument about extra effects T, right? So, for example, if you're thinking in terms of the GDDI water markets aff, which is one that was produced a little earlier, there's a bunch of different planks in there, a couple of planks about making water into property, a couple of planks about, improving the pricing structure, et cetera. Some of those things might be topical and others might be extra topical, right? Based on, a lot of things are included in there to solve something, but there's a question of whether or not all of the things that are included are topical. Okay. Another area where the solvency advocate might be generally pretty helpful is in thinking about counterplans. So a lot of times those other recommendations that you see in there that expand beyond the plan serve as counterplans that can solve the plan better. So for example, sometimes there can be some non-water recommendations that serve as advantage counterplans that solve the aff, that then use topic DAs or impact turns as a net benefit. So for example, against the atmospheric water aff in the AT lab, if a solvency advocate has a recommendation about, regulating cloud seeding, but also has some other recommendations that solve water scarcity without changing the cloud seeding regulations that are described in that plan to solve advantage 1, right? You could sort of pair that with maybe like a cloud seeding bad impact turn or geoengineering bad impact turn, right? So, you can sort of make make some advantage counterplan strategies based off of, what's written there. An additional note about counterplan writing here. One thing that's really useful is to read solvency advocates carefully to see why the federal government or a specific agent is key, right? So why the federal government or a specific agent is key. A lot of times people will include solvency advocates with Fed key warrants that writing a well-worded counterplan text can solve. I put that in quotes there because a lot of times cards will say something like, the federal government could do something, not that the federal government must do something or that only the federal government can do something, right? So for example, back to the atmospheric water thing, if a federal Fed key warrant for the atmospheric water aff is that other options haven't worked in the past because of interstate disagreements, right? That seems like a state compact counterplan that fiats through that disagreement would solve 100% of the case, right? So identifying what a solvency advocate says and why it's saying the federal government is key really helps you sort of write better counterplan text and write counterplans that sort of make sense. Okay. One last area where solvency advocates are helpful is generating neg disads, picks, and case turns. So neg disads, picks, and case turns. So solvency advocate articles tend to be are more qualified, and as such tend to be more balanced in accounting for the advantages and disadvantages of a policy proposal. Okay. So for example, if you look at the CAFO's aff that sort of BK and Susco's lab help orchestrate, my guess is that you'll likely find a law review that contains the solvency advocate, and it'll probably include all of the people who oppose the arguments in, a particular advantage. So you can find, whenever you look at sort of a qualified article from like a law review or from a professor, they're likely going to be writing a pretty balanced account. The people who are writing like it causes extinction are usually the crackpots. They're usually the people who are a little bit loony. The people who are more, even keeled are likely the qualified people who are like, well, there are some advantages and disadvantages, and then I ultimately think that there is an advantage, right? For those article, they'll be citing who disagrees with the proposal. So, you can use sort of the footnotes in a solvency advocate article or the endnotes to see where the articles are coming from, where the controversy is, right? So you can find sort of the things that, the affirmative article is responding to by using the footnotes. Once you've read those neg articles and exhausted some of those footnotes, the next thing that you kind of want to do is use Google Scholar's cited by function. Okay. My guess is that Truth might have gone over this in sort of research, but, and also maybe a BK sort of research lecture in the first week. But the cited by function is really nice because you can sort of input the article that, you just read, that was the neg article, and then find all of the most recent article that cites those negative articles, right? And the reason why sort of that's a good approach is that you'll likely find some off-case positions that are specific to that aff that way. So you might find some specific neg disadvantages, or you might find a pick that says that a certain thing that, the affirmative does, there needs to be an exception, right? Or you might find some case turns that way. And that's sort of, an important part of case neg research. Okay, so we've beat the solvency advocate over, like a dead horse. The solvency advocate is done. We've read it forever, and we've found all the negative arguments. What's the next thing you should do? Well, the second step is to do sort of the same process with the other cards in the 1AC. So in particular, internal link card articles that connect the plan to the terminal impact is a good place to look because they tend not to talk about the plan exclusively, okay? So let's say that you're working on a case frontline to an economy advantage, and maybe the 1AC economy advantage is something like, the plan reduces inflation, inflationary pressures crush the economy, and then economic decline causes war. Okay. The second card that's in that advantage, the card that says inflationary pressures crush the economy, is really unlikely to be about the plan. They'll probably include other issues that are affecting inflationary pressures, for example, that serve as good alt cause arguments or advantage counterplans, right? Once you cut that initial card, you're not done. What's necessary for the neg block is to find additional cards that those alt causes or alternative actions in the counterplan are more important in solving for that advantage, in this case, the economy, okay? That's sort of important because being able to not only say that there are other alt causes, that those other alt causes subsume the aff takes you a much longer way, right? So just asserting, for example, that there are other things that cause inflation is not that helpful because the 2AC is just going to say, well, the plan's the first step, it's good, the end. Okay. The negative wants sort of an additional card that says the other alt cause that's being described is a bigger factor in causing inflation, right? So it makes it a little much harder for the affirmative to just come back and be like, well, the aff is a good first step. It's like, no, it's not really even a first step at all because it doesn't even affect the largest share of the thing that's causing, in this case, inflation, right? So, having card one that's like, this is the alt cause, and then having card two that's like, this alt cause subsumes and is more important and, in the context of, for example, droughts, right? If that's an advantage, it's like, that's something that would be pretty helpful, okay? Once you're finished doing sort of this process with internal link cards, the impact cards are also good sources for offense. So, a couple things, well, both defense and offense. So impact card articles are good for alt causes and advantage counterplan arguments because the larger impact claim definitely does not focus on the plan action. So like your generic card that's like economic decline causes war is not like the plan is key to solve it. It's like that's not in that article. That article is probably describing some other solutions to the issue that's being described. Okay. Beyond that, impact cards and affirmatives about existential risks tend to be hyperbolic drivel that's less qualified and more trigger happy to inflate claims about civilizational collapse. Okay, and that means sort of two things for you, I think. First, it means that you can write some well-worded analytics and establish why some of the things being described in those impact cards are not that great and not that intelligent. You might also be able to make sort of offensive arguments. So you might be able to find, if you're more sort of a K person, you'll be able to find some of the best advantage K style arguments in those impact cards and maybe in those internal link cards. So, it's pretty helpful because it's like a lot of the cards. So let's say, for example, there's a very famous like Deutsch African instability causes war card that's out there for an impact. And that card uses like the language of, Africa is a rabid tiger, right? It's like you can find a good set of like security K and maybe like race related criticisms of that language. And looking at sort of the impact card will sort of give you some, good inroads into sort of being able to quote certain lines in the card that you think are objectionable and then generating sort of your critique that way. In general, if you're more of a K heavy person, I would not prepare a critique against a known affirmative by starting from a theory you're comfortable with and then trying to jam the affirmative into your ideological model. Okay, so I wouldn't start by saying, I really understand the settler colonialism, and let me try to jam this affirmative about atmospheric water into settler colonialism. Instead, you really want to sort of study the discourses that make up a 1AC, the internal link and impact cards, what kind of ideology they're situated in, what kind of link arguments are best, and then produce sort of a critique strategy. Okay, so let me give you an example. So let's say that you were putting together a critique against an affirmative that featured a North Korea impact scenario. And the impact scenario was like, the problem with Kim Jong-un and North Korea is that they're utterly irrational. They're super crazy and insane. Okay, it's like that's the language of the piece of evidence. If that's the case, right, instead of being like, okay, I really want to go for settler colonialism, so how can I describe that North Korea is settler colonial? It's like, that's not a super effective way to establish your critique strategy. Instead, you might be like, what are the sort of like languages that are used in this 1AC impact card that I think I can establish the best link to? So, for example, the idea of, North Korea being insane, crazy, irrational, right, might be, better language for an argument that's about ableist language, right? It might mean that your critique arguments should be specific to the way that these impacts and et cetera are framed, as opposed to sort of the other way around where you're like, I like the, deep eco K, I'm going to jam this app in. Okay. Okay. So you've read these cards, you've read, the, solvency advocate, you've read the internal link cards, and you've read the impact cards. Okay. The third step that, you want to do when putting together a case neg is to think about which of the generics have the best engagement with the affirmative. Okay, which of the generics have the best engagement with the affirmative, and see if you need to cut some additional cards to make them work. So let's say that you think the best strategy against the AT atmosphere aff is a state compacts counterplan. Okay, it's paramount to cut solvency evidence that says compacts are able to solve atmospheric permits. It's not enough to just have a generic states file that says the states can do water policy, right? Because my guess is that the affirmative has likely cut some cards that say the states aren't able to do atmospheric permits in particular because of a certain reason. So you need to be able to, you need to sort of cut additional cards for those generics to make them work. Okay. If the net benefit to the counterplan is the politics disad, right, you need to cut some cards that are links to atmospheric water. Or at the very least, maybe the idea of weather modification or geoengineering, because it's not that helpful to just have cards that are generically like, people don't like water policy, because they'll likely have cut some cards that say atmospheric water maybe has sort of a different relationship to the different, constituencies within Congress, right? Alternatively, if you're thinking about a critique, if your strategy is to read the settlerism critique, You shouldn't be content with just reading some cards that water is a resource, or worse, that the state is bad. Okay, that's a recipe for an L and a 27, maybe a 28, and more recent speaker points. Instead, you have to link cards about the 1AC. So, what are the assumptions, values, and methods that it upholds? If the IBWC app in the GG lab is about treaties in Mexico, right? The link arguments should not just be water is a resource. The link arguments should be about the historical baggage associated with the creation of treaties between the US and Mexico. Maybe there's a set of link arguments that are specific to the idea of the IBWC. There might be link arguments to sort of unilateral minutes or unilateral action by the United States on behalf of Mexico, right? That is sort of the work that ends up winning your debates, right? So that's sort of the strategy in terms of cutting a case neg, is you start with the solvency advocate, you do the internal links and impact, and then cut sort of additional stuff for your generics. And that generally will create sort of a complete version of your argument. You want to do this in your labs. So if you're assigned to one of the lab affs, that's sort of the process by which you should take. Okay. Final thing that I kind of want to talk about before I open it up a little bit to questions is I want to talk a little bit about how to organize a case neg. Okay. How to organize a case neg. Functionally, a case neg should have the following things. Okay. First of all, a case neg needs a hat titled case, okay, under which you should have something that, basically approximate a 1NC front line to each advantage, solvency, or preempts contention. So what does that look like? Like, what does a 1NC front line look like? Well, a 1NC front line looks like it's multiple responses to a certain contention or advantage that somebody has produced. Those multiple responses should have a mix of analytic arguments and evidence. So, if I was reading the plan solves the economy because of inflationary pressures, advantage, my 1NC front line should not just be 4 cards that say economic decline doesn't cause war. It should instead be a diverse set of responses, both with cards and analytics. So I might say something like, inflationary pressures are already high now. I might also make the argument that inflationary pressures don't have much to do with the economy. I might make the argument that actually not inflationary pressures, but debt is a bigger cause of economic decline. I might also say economic decline doesn't cause war, right? The thing that you might notice there is that I've tried to sort of hit the advantage from every different angle so that it's harder for the 2AC to respond. Some of the arguments that I'm making there might be analytics. So I might not necessarily have a card that says, the debt is a bigger internal link to economic decline, not inflation, but that might be an analytic that I put in there. Or I might be like, people are unlikely to go to war under economic decline because they won't have the resources to do so, right? That might be an analytic argument you put in there, right? So you want to sort of have a mix of those two. My suggestion would be, I would have about like I'd say 60% cards, 40% analytics is sort of a good split. That's not really a hard, fast rule, but that's sort of a general suggestion that I would have. Once you've put together these 1NC front lines, the thing that I would do next is you need 2NC extensions. You need 2NC extensions to the best arguments with additional cards that make distinct warrants or impact claims. I'll repeat that again because I think this part is important. You need 2NC extensions to those 1NC front lines to the best arguments with additional cards that make distinct warrants or impact claims. So, for example, let's say in your 1NC front line, one of your main arguments is that there are some alt causes to atmospheric water decline. It's not the regulation of cloud seeding that matters, but maybe emissions from cars. Okay, that's a pretty good arg. The thing that sort of needs to happen next is the 2NC, right, can't just, reread the tag to the card and call it a day, right? For a 2NC to be effective on case, you need some additional cards. So, what I would sort of suggest is a couple of things, right? You should have some cards that say that particular thing is a bigger internal link or bigger alt cause than the affirmative cause, right? So you might be like car emissions are sort of a much bigger part of pollution and of water and maybe, stopping, of causing droughts and whatnot, right? You might have a card that says that. You might have some additional alt causes. So you might be like, not only are car emissions a big deal, but maybe so are factory emissions and maybe the emissions in India and that are not in the United States, right? You might have some other alt causes that sort of fill out a 2NC. So you shouldn't be sort of, happy with just having one argument right? You should make sure that you have some 2 and C arguments to really expand the argument that you're making, okay? In general, sort of the rule of thumb that I suggest is you should have 1 card in the 1 and C making a specific argument, and then you should have 2x plus 1 cards in the negative block, where x basically is the number of affirmative cards that relate to the arg. Okay, so if the affirmative is presented evidence that that cloud seeding, for example, is the most important thing when establishing, when sort of trying to solve global warming, right? I would try to have 3 cards, 2x plus 1, right? 2 times 1 plus 1 is 3. So you would have 3 cards in the negative block to respond to that argument, and that's sort of the goal that you want. Okay. In general, your lab mates are going to be giving 2 and C's, and maybe so are you, or maybe you're giving a 1 in our own case. And they definitely want cards. So you definitely want sort of alternative, not just 1 card on the section, but multiple. Related to that, you also want cards that have distinct warrants, right? So you don't want 3 cards that say economic decline doesn't cause war because of a reduced amount of resources, right? That's not really all that helpful. In fact, you only need 1 of those cards. That being said, if you have multiple reasons why economic decline does not cause war that are all distinct, right, that is pretty helpful. So if you're like, economic doesn't cause war, 1, there's no such thing as a diversionary war. People just do Twitter fingers and not trigger fingers. 2, less resources to go around means people will not go to war. 3rd, it results in more like isolationism. See COVID, like when we had a recession, the US started to care about itself, not about other countries, so we're not going to go to war. So it's like, those are 3 different warrants, right, that you might establish for why economic decline does not cause a war. Yeah, and it's like, that's helpful because it's like you can just assert, for example, that those are 3 distinct things that the aff now has to answer one by one, not just sort of group and complete. So when you're cutting sort of the additional cards, you also want to sort of keep in mind that your evidence should have some diverse things that it's doing or strategic reasons why it exists. Okay. You don't necessarily need extensions to every single argument for the 1 and C frontline. You should have extensions to the best set of arguments. So, if you think the best answer to the warming advantage on the atmosphere aff is that other emissions outweigh, then you might have sort of a, big extension of that, but not necessarily an extension of global warming doesn't cause extinction, which is a less good argument. That being said, when you're writing a case neg, the more sort of extensions you're able to write, the better, because you can sort of decide based off of the coverage of a team, as opposed to relying simply on just what you thought was sort of a good argument as an earlier premise. Okay, so once you've created the case hat, the next set of things that you want to do organization-wise is you want to create a hat for each affirmative specific off case argument. A hat for each affirmative specific off case argument. When I say affirmative specific off case argument, I don't mean the generics. I mean, like, if, for example, you were cutting the case next to the atmosphere aff and you, for example, found some cards that say regulating cloud seeding would hurt cloud permitters, and cloud permitters are key to the economy. It's the cloud permitter is disadvantage, right? That's an affirmative specific DA. Right? Or if you're cutting an advantage counterplan to one of the teams, right, you might have some specific counterplans to the advantages for, I don't know, the IBWCF, right? For each hat, so you should have a hat for each one. So if I cut an advantage counterplan and a case-specific disad, I should have a hat for the advantage counterplan and a hat for the case-specific disad. What should I have under each hat? You want a 1 and C shell. So you want a 1 and C shell for whatever the advantage counterplan is, right? If it's an advantage counterplan, it should include a counterplan text. It should probably include some solvency cards, right? If it's a disadvantage, parts of a disad, like you need a unique disargument, you need a link, you need an internal link, and an impact, right? So you want sort of a 1 and C shell. You should also have 2 and C cards. So no one has ever gone for a disadvantage that only has 1 and C things unless it's been dropped, right? And you should always prepare for teams that are good. So you should also have 2 and C cards. So if it's a counterplan, you need some additional solvency cards. You should have some answers to permutation style cards, and then you should also have answers to anticipated offense. And what I mean by that is, my guess is that when you're doing your research for the negative, you'll likely come up with some affirmative cards. And that basically should indicate to you just what kinds of things that the affirmative is likely to say in the face of your DA. So you can sort of create AT or answers to style blocks that respond to what you think are sort of the best affirmative responses that you might anticipate. Okay. Similar thought about a disad. So for disadvantage, you should have some answers to affirmative articles. You should have some answers to anticipated offense. You should have some cards that, beef up your uniqueness argument. You have some separate link arguments, right? So that's sort of what you want to do in terms of the 2&C and create some blocks in that manner. Lastly, let's say you're writing a K, like you should have a 1&C shell for sure. You should have some, 2&C link cards that are affirmative specific. Maybe you have found some, rhetorical, moves in the impact cards that you really want to quote. That's great. You should include that into your tags and cut some cards about it. You should, have some answers to blocks. Like they might say that, some common stuff like, the alternative is whack and doesn't solve and is only individual. Right? It's like you might have some blocks that sort of respond to some of those easily anticipated arguments. Okay. Finally, the last sort of thing that you kind of want to include organizationally is a hat for generic arguments that you already have. A hat for generic arguments that you already have. So, my guess is that you'll likely find that the state's counterplan file or the EPA DA file or whatever is the settler colonialism file has a pretty good application to a set of affirmatives that's being read. The goal for sort of this section is not just to copy paste cards that already exist, but to basically update with whatever additional stuff is needed. Okay. So for example, right, if I'm trying to put together a state's counterplan against the atmosphere aff from the AT lab, I would probably include a couple things under this hat. I would include a 1&C counterplan text that I want to read. So, maybe you want to write a state compact counterplan. I don't know. But like, if that's the case, I might be like, the 50 states should establish a compact that, establishes regulations for cloud seeding, for example, right? So you might create a counterplan text that is specific to the affirmative itself. Okay. You might want to cut more cards to sort of fill out, what's missing in that generic against that aff. So, I said a little earlier, my guess is that the atmosphere aff has been written to try to answer the state's counterplan. It's like that probably means that you need some more specific solvency cards on this atmosphere aff to make sure that you have evidence that say that states are able to create these kinds of permits, right? For disads and critiques, this might mean you want more specific 2&C link cards that are aff specific. The IBWC aff, the Mexico, the GG aff, right? If I was trying to put together a settler colonialism K there, I might be trying to find some specific cards about treaty logic, about sort of the historical relationship between the United States and Mexico, and maybe about water sharing. I might be trying to create link arguments about sort of the IBWC and its treaty mechanism specifically, right? Just 2&C link cards that are aff specific. For topicality, you might be finding specific violation cards. So let's say, I'm reading one of the cards from the Klarman T generic that says that, protection does not include conservation. It has to only include cessation of use. I might include some cards that are like, if I'm reading, against Atmo, I might be like, cloud seeding is conservation, or stopping cloud seeding or regulating cloud seeding is conservation. Right? That's a specific violation card that denies that, the affirmative is topical. Or you might find limits cards that say, maybe there's a huge number of ideas that are under the umbrella of conservation, and you want to sort of, make the case list a little bit more limited. So these are sort of, so for the generics hat, you basically kind of want to cut the specific, like aff specific cards that you need to sort of complete the argument alongside sort of the generic stuff that you already have. So that's largely the organization of a case neg. So you have sort of a section titled case that has all the case front lines and some 2&C extensions. You have sort of additional off-case arguments against affirmatives that you might want to read. And then you might have some specific, cards under generics to respond to a particular aff. Okay, that's sort of how you write a case neg in 40 minutes. Does anybody have any questions, either about how to write a case neg, suggestions for certain affirmatives? So if you're like, I'm writing a case neg to X particular aff and I'm having a hard time, or anything else. Aaron, I don't know if I mispronounced your name. I apologize if I did.
I had a question about writing case neg. So like for K-affs in particular, what would you suggest? Like is there like any difference in like cutting case negs for like policy affs versus like K-affs?
There's some differences, although there are some similarities too. I know Turner is probably doing the, write a case snagging SK teams lecture, so I don't want to steal his thunder necessarily, but I think there's a couple of things, right? So I do think that you should always start from the solvency advocate, and usually in this case for critical affirmatives, it'd be like the method card is usually the one that is talking about it. Right, I would try to figure out what is going on and what is sort of the method, and is the author just talking about the method or talking about other things? Is the author maybe citing some negative articles that describe people who say that the method is bad, or the things that the critique is critiquing are probably things that could be negative, right? So like let's say for example that affirmative that is largely about Afro-pessimism is criticizing a set of literatures about settler colonialism. It's like, okay, well, my guess is that settler colonialism might be a good negative argument because there is a substantive disagreement between those two areas, right? So it's like that's sort of a way that you might sort of start thinking about negative strategy there. I think the big differences are, a lot of times the sort of like alt cause and counterplan approach doesn't really make a lot of sense for critical affirmatives. I think instead, sort of the thing that you kind of want to do is think more holistically about just what is the critique and what does it disallow? So if the critical affirmative says something like water should not be considered a resource, it's like, well, the set of arguments that say water should be considered a resource is a good impact turn to the critique affirmative. So, my guess is that a set of industry arguments that are like water needs to be economized and seen as a utility would be an impact turn to a KF that says water should not be a utility for human needs, right? So a little bit more holistic approach there, which might be the big difference, but I do think you should always start with the solvency advocate so you know what's going on.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. Oliver.
Yeah, so my question regards your like I think if I remember this correctly, like your recommendation that we should have 60% cards and 40% analytics in the 1NC front line against Case. Is that correct?
Yep. That's my general suggestion. Sometimes, it might be a little bit less, a little more. Like it could be like 80-20. Sometimes it might be more like 40-60, but 40-60 is usually like if you don't have any cards against a case, like you might have a lot more analytics than case cards. Preferably, you're writing this case neg, so you'll at least make the 60-40 line. My guess is that you might have more, but it depends a little bit on the quality of evidence. And then just if you feel like you can really sort of like obliterate an aff with analytics, like some affs are just so bad that they just don't belong, right? So if somebody's reading an advantage is just like so outrageously stupid, it's like you don't need a card. You should have some analytics that are like, this makes no sense, or these two cards don't sort of belong together in the same aff or don't have a connection.
I see. So it's more like have the analytics if number one, like the affirmative just is a little dodgy on like their mechanism, you're not exactly like sure how it really makes sense, or number two, the cards are like you don't have enough cards, or like the cards you have aren't as high quality as them.
Yeah, more or less. I would probably also add just analytics in general, like I think are undervalued just because people are like, why wouldn't you just read a card? I think analytics are good because if your analytic has some good warrants that sort of respond to the other side's argument, that's something that the other team has to respond to, right? So if I, like, let's say that I'm debating a disease causes extinction impact, and I might be like, here's some obvious stuff. We could socially distance. We can get some vaccines. And no disease has ever killed us, right? Those are the three analytics they put down. It's like, those are pretty good. Even if you don't have EV, it's like, it's now the ball's back in the AF court to prove why any of those things are not true, right? So, I would include some of the analytics and add them in if you think they're sort of good responses to sort of the, case in addition to evidence.
Yeah, I mean, usually I'm just like, I like to have analytics in the later speeches, but yeah, I think it's a good thing if you have like nice, good analytics and just kind of like, to get them a little bit.
Yeah. Like I would suggest putting them in the 1NC just because I think you want to sort of plant the seed of doubt in the judge's mind early rather than later, right? So it's like, if it's later, then the 1AR can be a little bit dodgy, and then the 2NR will be like, you were kind of dodgy, and the 2AR can be like, new explanation, here it comes. But if it's like a constant theme from the 1NC onwards, it's hard for the affirmative to do that.
Okay, yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Yep. Kevin.
So do you think it's better to cut case nags for genres of affs, or should we try to make it as specific as possible to each individual version of an affirmative during the year?
So during the year, here's sort of my suggestion. So at the DDI and during the year is a little bit different. At the DDI, you have basically the 1AC. So you want to cut it as specific to the 1AC that's given as possible. That being said, right, there might be some modifications that happen. So let's say, I don't know, like the AT atmosphere lab finds out that advantage one is just hot nonsense. It's like if your whole, case negative was only about advantage one, then you're in tough territory if the, AT lab decides to pick a new advantage, or probably not new advantage, but like axe that portion of the advantage. You know what I mean? So you want to make sure that you have some specific stuff, but you also have some stuff that generally applies to sort of that plan mechanism. I think during the year for case negs, here's sort of my general suggestion, and this is sort of what I suggest to my teams that are going into the year. The first is that you do want some general case negs, and you want them against some of the core affs that you saw from camp. So, not just the DDI, labs, like I would make sure to have case negs, although naturally the process of writing a case neg here will help you with that. Thankfully. I would also make sure to have case negs to the Michigan 7-week apps and just, make sure that you're ready to go. Because a lot of the, debates in UK and Green Hill and sort of the first tournaments of the year tend to be just rehashings of old stuff because people haven't had time to do additional research since camp. I'd say usually it's like 70% of the teams, and I'd say 30% of the teams will be reading something that's not about a camp app. And then during the year, you should write some specific stuff. So let's say, you all debate, I don't know, like North Broward GG a lot for some reason. It's like, okay, like if that's the case, then you might as well start writing a case negative to North Broward GG. It's AF, right? And have like a very specific thing about it rather than just the general genre of what the affirmative is. So I think, preseason, probably a little bit more general. During season, probably a little bit more specific to specific teams. Any other questions? Yeah, Oliver.
Yeah, so on the like kind of 2x plus 1 card recommendation, is that for like just like offensive arguments you're making, or like and is it's also specifically for case?
So it's not necessarily about offense, it is about case. So it's about the number of cards you should be reading on a 2NC when you're extending a case argument. So if I started with a single card in the 1NC, and then the affirmative, so let's say you're having this impact debate about economic decline not causing war. The 2AC is like, yes, econ decline, Arcanus and evidence says it causes diversionary war, period. Okay. The 2NC should extend that initial card in the 1NC, be like economic decline does not cause war, blah, blah, this is our evidence. And then should read additional cards. And the number of additional cards, usually my suggestion is 2x plus 1. So the x is the number of cards referenced in the 2AC. So in this case, I'm like the Tonneson evidence, right? So I might be like, they have one card that substantiates this claim. I should have 3 cards that tries to bury it. And the reason why I sort of talk about it like that is the negative block is sort of an expansive period of time, right? So you could technically just bury the other team on a certain area. And if the other team just said, economic decline, that's Tonneson diversionary war, it's like, it's hard to come out of that hole in the 1AR when you're like, I only cited 1 card and they have like, they're 4 cards deep on this question, right? So that's sort of a general suggestion that I would have for case. So you kind of, I think the thing to take away from that is, it's not like a science. So like if they read 2 cards and you didn't read 5 cards, you lose. Like it's not like that. Like, that you should try to read double the number of cards that they read just because of the time asymmetry that exists in the negative block. But the thing that you definitely don't want to do is you don't want to just reread the 1NC tag and re-explain it and call it a day. Like there needs to be not just the initial thing that was sent on the 1NC, but further development of that argument, which usually requires additional cards, if that makes sense.
Now, and this also applies more so with affirmatives who are not reading that many impacts. Because if you have like an affirmative that reads like, 4 impacts in the 1AC, like let's just say they have separate scenarios, you'd end up reading like, that would be, let's see, 2x. So that would be like 11, actually 12 cards, right?
So the thing to think about there is just, so I gave the explanation of an impact. I think what maybe you would do there in that case, if they have multiple impacts, is it probably doesn't, yeah, you're right. It probably doesn't make sense to 2x plus 1 every impact card and just read impact defense the whole time, right? You might shoot earlier in the chain. So usually if there's 4 impacts, there's not like 4 separate links. There'll be like one link about droughts, and then there'll be like there's 5 impacts of that. 1 is ag, 2 is famine, 3 is the economy, 4 is whatever, right? That's usually the way that it goes. So then it's like you might read the 2x+1 number of cards on the link. So you might be like, the plan does not solve droughts, and then you might have several cards there. It's like that has now taken care of the rest of the impacts of the debate, because it severed the between the plan and then solving the multiple different kinds of impacts, if that makes sense. Yeah. Any other questions about writing a case neg? Something that you will be doing very shortly or have already started on. Your lab leaders will be very excited that you learned how to put together a case neg today. Okay, it seems like no other questions. So happy to let you all go to lunch. Enjoy lab.